Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Frank Festa, the producer of the show, filling in for our host, Jeff Pillay. Thanks for being with us. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Elaine Kamarck, founding director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institution, a nonpartisan American think tank. Elaine helped lead the National Performance Review in the 90s as part of the Clinton administration. It was nicknamed REGO for reinventing government and focused on things like cutting wasteful spending and inefficiencies in federal programs, workforce reductions, and decentralizing authority. Now, if that sounds familiar, it's because the National Performance Review represents one of the last major ventures by the federal government, similar to what President Donald Trump and Elon Musk hope to do with the Department of Government Efficiency, also known as DOGE. With the administration's agenda starting to take shape, we thought now would be a great time to talk with someone like Elaine to explore her perspective on DOGE and hear a little bit about her experience spearheading one of the last major federal efforts to make the government more efficient. Elaine, thanks for coming on the show. It's great to meet you.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so just to start, Elaine, I was wondering if you could take us back to the early days of the Clinton administration when the National Performance Review was just getting off the ground. What was the national environment like at the time that gave rise to citizens demanding government reform?
Well, the most important thing to know about it is that when Clinton ran in 1992, the situation was not very much different than it is now. People had a very negative view of the Democratic Party, and they thought we were out of touch culturally, which they do today. They thought we were out of touch on economics and out of touch on government. And on government, Bill Clinton realized that he had to be true to the values of the Democratic Party, but he also had to indicate that he understood people's frustration. So, a guy named David Osborne wrote a book called Reinventing Government, and Clinton adopted that title at least and promised that when he was president, he would reinvent government, that he would have a big proposal, a big project, with the goal of which was to shrink the government and to make it more efficient. So we began in a way that no other president since then has begun, except maybe for Trump, with a promise to the people to do something about the federal government. And he gave it to show the importance of it. He made it the vice president's project. So he gave it to Al Gore and he said, Al, you run with this, create it, we'll implement it. I'll be with you all the way. And the president was with us all the way. He knew what we were doing. He approved everything and signed a lot of bills and a lot of executive orders to make it all happen. So it had political heft to it. And that made a big difference.
So as we joked a little bit about before we hopped on the recording here, I was just a baby when this first started. So I learned a lot in advance of this interview, just reading up on it and learning about its history, what it accomplished. And one of the things that stuck out to me when reading around about it, I saw a journalist write that the NPR, quote, tried to make the government cool again, which sounds like a lot of fun. Some of the principles noted in that article that y'all were targeting included putting customers, AKA the American taxpayer, first, cutting red tape, empowering employees to get results, and cutting the government back to basics. Listeners' ears are probably ringing a little bit. That sounds a lot like DOGE and what they're up to, which again is why we were so excited to chat with you. We'll get into that in just a second. But first, in the 90s, what did pursuing those principles look like in practice? And how would you evaluate your success now with more than 20 years of hindsight?
Well, the first thing we did is we realized this had to be done within the government. So I was on the White House staff running it. We also then recruited about 400 people from around the government, mostly civil servants. My three top deputies had among them 75 years in the federal government. And they knew the ins and outs. They knew how to get things done. But the first thing we did is we recruited people from the agencies to look at other agencies. So we didn't let anybody review their own agency, right? That would have been a problem. But we had people, say, from Health and Human Services looking at HUD, Housing and Urban Development. We had people from USAID looking at the State Department, et cetera. And we divided them into task forces with about 12 people each. And the task forces then went into the agencies and talked to people in the agencies and tried to understand what they did, what they thought was going wrong, what looked like it was going wrong from the outside, and it was a review. It was a classic performance review. Now, the interesting thing about performance reviews, which seems to miss some of the subsequent reformers in government, have been techies who've been focused on things like, do you have a dashboard? And what are your statistics like, et cetera. The problem with that, which is all very important, but if you don't know from real people what's going on in an agency, you run into the problem of garbage in, garbage out. So the Obama administration discovered that even though they had this elaborate computerized dashboard for looking at what was going on at the Veterans Administration, veterans were dying and getting terrible care. And why was that happening? Well, people were lying, right? They were just putting in the statistics that they were the right statistics, but that was not what was in fact happening. So if you are not in the agency with people who are close to the work, gaining their trust and figuring out what's going on in that agency, you will not come up with a set of recommendations that actually fixes it. And that's what we did. We came up with 400 recommendations by September of 1993. And then we continually worked on different projects and we worked on implementation. And we worked on this all the way to the end also. So that's why we accomplished a lot. We cut 426,000 people from the federal government. We cut over 200,000 pages of regulations from the government. We passed a massive procurement bill. We fixed how the Federal Aviation Administration bought parts and bought computers for its all the technology that was involved in landing airplanes. We did fixes in, each agency was sort of different. So we did different things in different agencies to improve their performance. And we adopted, and this you mentioned in your introduction, we adopted customer service standards for the government. And at first, all these, Puritans said, "Oh, no, the people are not customers. They're citizens. They own the government." And we said, "Yeah, yeah, 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 yeah." But that's beside the point. We want to signal to the civil servants that they need to treat people as customers, not as, sort of somebody who's in their way. In other words, when somebody comes in for a passport, granted, you can't get a passport anyplace else from the government than the government, nor should you, but you should treat that person as if they were a customer. The appointment should be on time. You should be open on Saturdays sometimes. There's a lot of things that go into customer service. And let me just say, because I looked it up yesterday, there's one of these great weird things about this whole debate. 80% of Americans say they don't trust the federal government. They think it's terrible, right? They think it's full of waste, fraud, and abuse. There's a group called the American Customer Service Survey, and their business, it's a business, they're a private sector business. Their business is they evaluate customer service for big companies, for the retail industry, for the, hospitality industry, et cetera. And one of their customers is, in fact, the federal government. And all across the federal government, when they interview people who actually interacted with the federal government, and guess what? The satisfaction scores are 68, 69, 72%. In other words, when people interact with the federal government, they don't think it's wasteful and a big mess and a big confusing mess. They think they're doing a pretty good job. And that we started, okay? And the customer service standards, by the way, are now standard operating procedure. So what I say often is that many of the things we did in the 90s are now standard operating procedure in the federal government, and it's probably time that somebody took a second look at them, another look. It's been 30 some years. It's time to do this again.
So you wrote a piece for Brookings a little before Thanksgiving, which caught my attention. And in it, you call on DOGE to, quote, cut the government with a scalpel and not an axe. It feels like that should be on a billboard. It's a really nice tagline. DOGE, as listeners likely know now, has officially been created thanks to an executive order signed by the president, with Elon Musk, the world's richest man, CEO of Tesla and other companies, designated as its, quote, administrator. One of the biggest challenges facing Musk and DOGE is figuring out just what portion of the federal budget is actually eligible and feasible to be cut. Mandatory spending, if I have it right, is the biggest block of the budget. And in 2022, it represented about 65 or 66% of the total budget. And I have plenty of questions for you here, Elaine. But just to start, what qualifies as mandatory spending and why won't slash can't it be cut in your view?
There's 2 kinds of spending, right? Mandatory is basically things that are promised to you by the government in statute. The biggest one being your Social Security, okay? Also Medicare, also if you were in the military, your veterans benefits, if you were a civil servant, your retirement, etcetera. Now, the reason they're called mandatory is that Congress can't just change them year to year in the budget. They can't one year in the budget say, "Oh, people are gonna get $1,000 a month for Social Security, and next month they're gonna get $3,000 a month." Okay, you can't do that. You have to literally change the law before you can't do it in the budget. And therefore, in budgeting terms, it's mandatory. You just can't fool with that number. Now, the discretionary part of the budget are things that you can fool with from year to year. And so, for instance, go to Social Security, right? There's a Social Security Administration. It has about 75,000 people working there. Um, they can shrink or expand that number of people, and therefore it's discretionary. Programs in the Justice Department, programs all over the government, a lot of the government is discretionary. The Federal Aviation Administration, landing airplanes is part of the discretionary budget. Okay, and those you can fool with from time to time. The reason this is so important is that the mandatory piece of the budget, it's not just in 2022 or 2023, forever. That has been the biggest part of the budget. And if you want to save lots and lots and lots of money, you have to go in and you have to tell grandma and grandpa, "Oh, we're gonna cut your Social Security from 3,000 a month to 2,000 a month." I wouldn't advise doing that, but, and which is why it's called the third rail of American politics. You touch that and you die.
Sure, yeah. Well, I wanted to get parse out another detail there. That's funny. So that leaves discretionary spending as the slice of pie from which Doge is likely to whittle away at. You just gave us some examples of what that looks like, but I'm wondering as well, like what aspects of discretionary spending, we mentioned already, right, that mandatory spending really can't be touched. Are there aspects of discretionary spending that technically, practically, politically can't be touched either?
Well, those are not legally off limits, right? I mean, if Congress this month decided that they wanted to cut the FAA budget in half, sure, they could do
Okay.
that. The problem is that for practical purposes, they're off limits because a big chunk of their spending is air traffic controllers. If you cut air traffic controllers, there's nobody to land the planes. If there's nobody to land the planes, there's no landing slots. All of a sudden, the airlines have to cancel flights. All of a sudden, there are no flights, or the ones that are chronically late. So all hell breaks loose, right? That's the bottom line. So for practical purposes, there's large pieces of the government that you can't just stop doing for the purpose of saving money. That's why this is where the conversation started. That's why it's a scalpel, right? You have to look at each piece of it and say, okay, what here do we not need to do anymore? And take that out. But if you just go lopping things off the top,
Sure.
you're going to be in trouble.
Yeah, so it doesn't really seem like there's actually a ton for Doge to work with here, huh? It makes me wonder about I guess maybe like a two-part question for you. First, what do you think they maybe should focus on when looking to make the government more efficient? What aspects should they target?
Well, I think there's 2 big ones, and one of them they did start out talking about, which is cutting regulations, okay? And frankly, that doesn't save the government very much money, but it saves the private sector a huge amount of money and probably produces some efficiencies if you do it right and you cut obsolete things that just don't make any sense anymore. We did a massive regulatory review. The Obama administration did a massive regulatory review. So it's time to do that again. And they could, I think, do a lot of good by doing that. But it takes a lot of time because, again, you can't just say randomly, I'm going to cut half the regulations. Which regulations, right? Some regulations protect our food, for instance. And all of a sudden,
Right.
if you don't have that, in a couple months, you have people dying of cryptosporidium in, in their food, supply. So you can't just sort of lop it off. So that's one. The second thing, and this is where it seems the most recent information, this is where it seems DOGE is going, which is they have taken over what was called the United States Digital Service. And the US Digital Service is responsible for all the computer systems, and there's a lot of them in the federal government. And I would predict, I mean, I would hope that Elon Musk, with his genius high tech team, right, would in fact take a look at those systems, upgrade some of those systems, make those systems better. If you make the systems better, you probably first save some personnel, although frankly, it's not gazillions of dollars. I mean, but you'd save some, you'd cut some jobs, and you might make things work better. And that's really what the citizens want, is making things work better. So those are two good targets, but neither one, by the way, saves trillions of dollars.
Yeah, I think their initial target that they've walked back now was around 2 trillion. Yeah.
Yeah. Started out at 2 trillion. Everybody pointed out, myself included, that the entire discretionary portion of the budget was less than 2 trillion.
Okay.
It was 1.7 trillion. So you would have to wipe out the Bureau of Prisons. You'd have to
Oh
wipe
wow.
out the air traffic controllers. You'd have to wipe out the people who track weather and track hurricanes and stuff like that. I mean, gone. So all of a sudden they said, "Oh, that doesn't make sense." So then they sort of dangled that they would look at entitlements, and I think somebody in the White House, said, "Are you out of your minds? Don't do that. We can't do that."
Sure.
So now they're walking it back. So then he walked it back to a trillion or maybe less, and then he walked it back to over 10 years. See?
Oh, interesting. I haven't heard that. Is that a recent development?
Yeah, see, a lot of budgeting in the US is over 10 years. And so the numbers,
Yeah.
politicians love it. They sound big at first, but it's
Right.
really over 10 years. So
I forget what bill it was when I was in college that I was like, wow, they're just doing so much with this. And then I realized, I was like, wait, it's 10 years? I thought it was 1 year.
yeah, all right. Yeah, so I mean, they're walking those numbers way back because, reality hits you at some point.
Sure. And does that differ at all from what you think they will focus on?
Well, that's hard to say. I mean, the first thing they've focused on is getting rid of DEI offices in the government. And that's fine if you're in that party. I mean, that's part of what you promised, is part of your ideology and your belief system, okay, and that's certainly within the president's power, to do that. But it's kind of petty in the grand scheme of things. I mean, the DEI office in the Pentagon is a tiny fraction of the size of the Pentagon.
Petty in terms of like the amount of money that it takes up in the budget.
Amount of
Yeah.
money, the amount of people,
Sure.
it's just nothing. And that's the same all through the government, okay? So, yeah, that sends an important signal to his supporters, it's an important signal about the president's values, etcetera, but it's not saving money.
Fair. And that's what I've noticed as well too. Like a lot of symbolic things early on. It seems like a lot of different things like Doge or whether it's some of like cryptocurrency stuff. It seems like they are kind of in like maybe brainstorming mode right now and trying to figure out what to do a little bit more.
They're throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. That's really what's happening. They're seeing what they can do. I mean, and a lot of this, remember, is messaging. It's not real. So getting rid of birthright citizenship, I can promise you we're not gonna have a constitutional convention to amend the Constitution to get rid of this. It's simply not gonna happen, right? The judge has already said, "I'm not gonna implement. There's a stay until we can hear the arguments." So a lot of this is just messaging stuff, dressed up to make it look a little bit more real. But remember, executive orders are a very limited tool of the president. You cannot run an executive order that goes against the Constitution or that goes against a statute, right? I mean, if Congress has spoken on something, the president can't just say, "No, we're not gonna do that." That's, separation of powers.
You mentioned some constitutional objections there to birthright citizenship. I'm wondering for Doge specifically, are there any major legal hurdles they may encounter, whether they're constitutional or otherwise?
Well, it depends. If they stick to their knitting, right, and they really work on the computer systems, etcetera, they're probably gonna be on pretty safe ground. what they can't do is they can't change what goes into those systems, right? And I keep going back to the whole thing with technology is garbage in, garbage out, right? You can say, what is going into those systems? And they do not have the authority to change what goes into those systems.
Right.
Some other piece of the Trump administration might do that, but DOGE can't do that. Okay. Secondly, if they do a regulatory review, the undoing of regulations is as complicated as the doing of regulations in the first place. And there's something called the Administrative Procedures Act, which nobody's ever heard of. And it's very important because it says when you do a regulation, you have to follow a certain process. You have to give notice. You have to allow a period where the public comments, etc.
Right.
And you've got to follow certain steps. So in the first term, in Trump's first term, most of his attempts at cutting back regulations, including environmental regulations, failed. And they failed not necessarily on the merits, they failed because they had a bunch of inexperienced lawyers who just screwed it up. And it got before the judge, and the judge just threw it out, including Trump judges, by the way, just threw them out. So this time, my guess is they'll have more experienced lawyers and know a little bit better about how to do this, but it will take the full first term, and he's only got one term.
Walk us through, if you can, like what the process looks like. Like, let's say Elon and his team at Doge, they identify a certain aspect of the federal budget, and let's say the Department of the Education or any department that is wasteful, is making the government less efficient, yada, yada, whichever you prefer. What happens? How do they go about making those reforms? What does it look like in practice?
Well, let's take the Department of Education because they've all talked about eliminating the Department of Education. Prior administrations have talked about that and never done it. Why? You gotta look at what's in it. So, one of the biggest pieces of the Department of Education is the student loan program. And I don't think there's any support at all anywhere, maybe amongst some right-wing hardliners, for getting rid of student loans. Student loans are kinda good for the country. Now, if you wanted to get rid of the Department of Education, you'd have to take the student loan program and put it someplace. And the logical place to put it might be the Treasury Department because it deals with money and deals with loans. Okay, you could put that in the Treasury Department. Then there's the administration of Title I. Title I gives grants to poor schools in really poor neighborhoods to help give them, extra learning and help with their, the various problems in those schools. Okay, maybe you want to get rid of that. Maybe you want to cut it in half, etc. You still need a place where it's administered. You could put it in the Department of Health and Human Services. Okay, you could put it there. So, what happens to these grand plans is inside these are massive departments. By the way, the education department is the smallest one in the government. These are massive departments, and inside of them are things that people like having done. So you can move them around, but do you get any savings from moving them around? No, you don't get any savings. I mean, if they're here, in fact, you get costs because there's a transition cost of moving them into a new cabinet department. So you don't get savings. We never in reinventing government in the 8 years, we never thought seriously about moving someplace from one place to the other. It just didn't make any sense. That's the problem. If they do identify something they want to change and they think it's a good thing to change and there'll be real money associated with it, the first question is this statutory or is it regulatory? Statutory, they have to go back to Congress. There's no two ways about it. You got to go back to Congress and say, we'd like you, Congress, to change the law.
Okay.
And they have majorities in both houses, although the House majority is a two-person majority, a two-vote majority. Because they have majorities in both houses, they could probably get some laws passed. If
Mhm.
it's regulatory, if federal regulatory, they have to begin the regulatory process. They have to put out a notice of proposed rulemaking. They have to ask for public comment, da 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 da. So it's a process.
Right.
If it's just something that was done within the agency, within the department, then they can probably change it pretty easily by having the cabinet secretary say and the assistant secretary say, yeah, we want to change this. But remember this, we're talking about vast entities here, right? The way I think for our listeners to think about the federal government is think about it as the biggest holding company in the world. And that holding company has many, many, many divisions, and they're all doing different things. Some of those divisions are landing airplanes, and some of those divisions are thinking about our war in Africa. And some of those divisions are sending out checks to old people or disabled people. Okay. The variety of tasks in there is very complicated. If you find something that you wanna change, you need somebody to drive the change. And right now, they don't even have cabinet secretaries, and they will need assistant secretaries, deputy assistant secretaries to really get this going. That takes a while. In the first term, one of the many things they did wrong is they never paid any attention to the sub-cabinet level. So they had a lot of vacancies in the sub-cabinet level. They had a lot of career people just holding those jobs, and that was a problem because there was nobody to really do what the president wanted done. And in the absence of that, it's not that they do what he doesn't want done, it's in the absence of that, they follow the current law, or they follow the current regulation,
Sure.
absent actual change.
Something that came up for me in my brain while you were going through some of your prior experience there and walking us through some hypotheticals. I probably should ask this a little bit earlier, but with the NPR, was there anything that you guys wanted to do that you weren't able to get done? Like any like big slice of pie that you were looking at that would have been, man, this would have been really great if we got this done, but couldn't get it done? Could you bring us into that at all?
Yeah, the biggest piece we couldn't get done was civil service reform. Okay? The civil service is pretty antiquated, especially for this economy and this and all the technology. We wanted to change that. We never could because we never got a champion in the Congress. That would have definitely required congressional action. Now, the interesting thing is that we did actually manage to change a lot of the civil service agency by agency. Because what would happen is somebody would put in their appropriations bill or their authorization bill, and they would tack on reform. So, for instance, at NIH, the National Institutes of Health, in order to give out money to people to study how to get rid of cancer, right? You need some pretty smart people. You need people who actually know something about molecular biology, right? And the government was having a hard time hiring those people. So they got an exemption from some of the, salary caps, so they could hire the talent that they needed to do that. So around the government, we nibbled away at the civil service, but never really did comprehensive reform. And so that was a disappointment.
There is so much salesmanship that goes into marketing any political agenda or platform or initiative like DOGE. You're supportive of the desire to make the government more efficient, but as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, as you mentioned as well, you think it should be done with a scalpel and not an axe, carefully and thoughtfully. What sort of advice would you give to DOGE on making their ideas for reform more palatable to a broader American audience and for actually pulling off what they've promised to the American voters?
Americans want change. They want change in the government. There's no doubt about it. It's the devil in the details and the ability to say, we produce change that's important. And there, the bottom line is they have to do something that's very hard for conservatives to do. They have to stop dumping on the government. Because guess what? If you want to really get change to happen, you need the cooperation of the people who work there. You cannot just fire them all. I mean, you can close down DEI offices. Okay. The DEI offices, some people think they're good, some people think they're bad. None of them were central to the mission. DEI was not central to the mission of war fighting or landing airplanes. Okay. So nothing's going to happen there. You start doing this more deeply, you start cutting loads and loads of people who have expertise. And all of a sudden, when grandma's social security check doesn't come, something gets screwed up, there's no one to fix it. Now, that will make people really mad. So you've got to their reflexive hostility towards the government is in fact going to get in the way of their producing what they claim to produce.
Got it. Well, Dr. Elaine Kamarck of the Brookings Institution, thank you so much for your time today. I learned a ton, had a lot of fun talking to you, and hope we can chat again in the future. Hope to have you on the show someday down the line. So thank you so much, and I hope you have an awesome rest of your week.
Well, thank you, Frank. Nice to be here.
Yeah, and for our listeners, you can learn more about DOGE and Dr. Kamarck's work at the links in our show notes. We'll be back later this week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Frank Festa, the producer of the show, again, filling in for our host, Jeff Belay. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.